Who wishes to speak? Seeing no one, we'll move on to the fourth quarter high-level overview from the Finance Department.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this working? Sure. Hi, Roland. Good evening. Steve Barrett, Finance Director. Normally, we substitute the annual audit and the town's free cash certification in lieu of Q4 results, but in this unique year, we wanted to share some preliminary results. First item I wanted to talk about would be the general fund budget turnback. As the committee knows, the general fund operating budget was $35.6 million. At this point in time, as we continue to close the books, we're predicting a $1 million to $1.4 million general fund turnback. I'd like to point out some of the nice work by the accounting division. Lisa Wojcik, the town accountant, Joanne Norton, the assistant town accountant, Kristen Cowett, accounts payable, and Mary Beth Zabek, payroll. They've worked very hard to help us close out the year. In terms of that range of turnback, if you look at where some of the positive turnback came from, the Finance Department budget has all the benefits for the staff as we instituted or had in place a hiring freeze for a lot of the year. There are some unexpended benefits. At Moore Library, they had unexpended salaries. Same for HR and planning, where they had vacancies that resulted in unexpended salaries. Interesting, nursing division, you think with everything going on that they would kind of, completely expended their funds, but with everything going on due to COVID pressures, there was less call for, physical therapy appointments and different appointments that they, go out to homes for. So those were the areas where there were a positive turnback. In terms of some over expenditure or some negative turnbacks, keeping in mind that the town manager has a bottom line budget, the building department, we had some temporary labor that we had to fill in there to help with microfilming and permitting. There was a small deficit right now at the fire department general fund. As the committee knows, when you deal with a collective bargaining agreement, when we do have a hiring freeze, sometimes you have to fill open positions at time and a half. So the hiring freeze can kind of push costs up a little bit. And in public facilities, which is our the new name for municipal properties, that division, they had a lot of building retrofits to do in the last year. The CARES Act capped building improvements at $150,000, so there were some costs that went over there. So, one piece of our year end is our turnback, and our range is up on the screen. The next area I'd like to discuss would be local receipts. As the committee knows, this is a small piece of our total funding for the community. Our total expected or estimated local receipts, $5.6 million. Our year-to-date was about $5.2 million. So with rounding, we're about $350,000 short. The short came in really 4 areas. The first area, motor vehicle excise, was off. Fees, licenses, and permits was off a little bit. Meals tax was off just a little bit. And kind of the biggest area we had a problem with was investment income. Before we went into the pandemic, we were starting to earn about 1.5 points free on, free money on reserves, 1.5%. The pandemic has pushed rates down to 30 or 40 basis points. So our investment income kind of took a real, whack. Of interest to some of the people on the group, Mr. Noon might remember that back in the prior recession, or the Great Recession of 2009, 2010, at that point, we had about a $700,000 investment income budget. So on some levels, we didn't get hurt as much this time around because rates were already low and we didn't budget, a lot there. So, I think overall, we took in 94% of our total local receipts. We've been really following this for, half of the fiscal year. But at the end of the day, we were a little bit short on our local receipts. Some other items that you might find interesting. Thank you very much to the committee and Mr. Martin in the audience and any of the taxpayers that are watching. We have a 99.5% collection rate. The thing that amazes me is if you look at the receivable on the books, it is lower at June 30th, 21 than it was at June 30th, 2020. So as we went into the main piece of the pandemic and the health crisis for the fiscal year, our collection rate actually got even better by a couple of points. And this is extremely important to me, as 93% of all general fund services are provided and paid for by the property tax revenue. I'd like to real quick, a great job by our tax collector office, led by Teresa O'Leary. Adam has spent some time and met with her, Tara Bicknell, Jashira Gonzalez, and Olga Camille. They were especially working, the quarters that were due. There was a real appetite to see where the collection rate stood every quarter because, we thought that would be an area of sensitivity. And thank you to those staff for really helping to bring our records together in a timely fashion. Up on the screen as well, you'll see we are predicting that our free cash will stay the same or go up from FY20. Our FY20 free cash was $3.7 million. Our FY19 free cash was $3.7 million. So again, we see our free cash position stabilizing, if not improving. At this point in time, the accounting division is preparing documents to put into the state for free cash submission. That will be done in September 2021. As the committee knows, town accounting must submit balance sheets, revenue expenditure statements, a debt statement, receivable statement, and this covers over 300 funds. So here's something I've been working on. In an effort to try to change it up a little bit and make things a little more visually appealing, what I tried to do was list the enterprise fund, its FY20 free cash balance, and whether the fund in FY21 provided any net liquidity. Net liquidity is defined by us in finance as a simple term, cash receipts less cash disbursements and encumbrances. So on this chart, and we'll go one at a time, the Septage Enterprise Fund started the year at $90,000 in free cash. Due to the shutdown and the stay-at-home order at times, that was probably one of our better performing enterprise funds. Its revenues beat its expenses by $30,000 or $40,000, provided plenty of net liquidity in 21, and for 22 we see no issue there. Moving over to the transfer station, they started the year at close to $500,000 of certified free cash. They had a red on net liquidity primarily due to recycling costs. If you and we continue to dive into the details, that one line item I think went over close to $100,000. So we're struggling to, keep that program moving. Recycling market has gone a little bit sideways for certain things, and as people on the committee know, the spot markets, they move like the ocean at times. So for the transfer station, even though we had a net liquidity decrease, we believe in FY22 that we'll be able to continue to manage that enterprise fund. The ambulance enterprise fund started the year $610,000. This one I watched a lot during the year. Given some of the things that happened, I was moved a little bit back into one of my favorite roles as a financial analyst. So I got a chance to look at a lot of this data. The ambulance enterprise fund, if you think about it, it handles emergency medical services. And during FY21, if you think about it, a good portion of the time, the schools were working hybrid or remote. There weren't a lot of people out. So at the end of the day, this fund did experience some negative net liquidity, but I think our revenues were off about 12 or 13%. We were short about $150,000 out of about $1.2 million. So on one level, that's a good amount of money. On another level, I think having that degree of runs come in during a year when there was a lockdown in place, to me, says that is a very predictable revenue stream. And in FY22, even though it had negative liquidity in 21, we kind of have a caution flag thrown on that, and we'll continue to monitor the ambulance enterprise fund. Transportation enterprise fund, that will probably come out as the big winner. It started the year at $16,000 in fund balance, certified free cash. It receives all its funding on day one of the fiscal year. And at the end of the day, the town had to scale back that program due to the lack of demand for certain services. We focused on the vulnerable services in town, the door-to-door for medical, for food vulnerability. And those services can cost anywhere from $30,000 to $35,000 a month. But at the end of the day, that fund had tremendous net liquidity. Its outlook is green. I think you'll probably see that enterprise fund have certified free cash around the $300,000 level. And again, most of that was because our demand for certain things like the shuttle and certain discretionary transportation services, that need pretty much evaporated in the last fiscal year. So that enterprise fund did fine. The sewer enterprise fund started the year with $1 million in free cash. That fund also has $1.6 million in stabilization fund. It had positive liquidity. It was minor, but it was a positive number. And looking forward to 22, we put that in green as well. The fund that had some serious operating issues was the commuter parking lot fund. Started the year very healthy. At one point, we had 5 cars down there, and there's 100 times more spots than that. That had significant negative liquidity. We assigned it a yellow rating for 22. We'll see. What we've done, though, the one major thing I think we've tried to do is we have informed Director Saganowicz, who oversees transportation, that the commuter parking lot for FY22 and 23 will not be able to fund transportation. So those were a couple of things that the town manager decided on, and that will help that fund, although that fund really had a bad year. And so I'm trying to mix it up a little bit and trying to get some more visual things in there. So here's a chart on our reserves, basically. I just wanted to put this in here to show folks our, a little bit of a history. Let me fill it in a little bit for you. I think you'd find it interesting that in 2009, Standard & Poor's signed off on our AAA. In 2010, I believe Moody's signed off on our AAA. The phenomenon you see in the middle is the way the state makes us do the accounting, we can only collect money that comes in the prior year. We can only budget what comes in. So what happens is when a community exits a recession and revenues pick up, since you can't spend it right away, it goes into reserves. And that's how, when we exited the Great Recession, 2010, you see our reserve level spike to about $9.3 million in FY14. At that point in time, it was determined that we had too many reserves. We started a controlled takedown of reserves. Also, we moved $2 million into a general fund stabilization fund. That's why you see those reserves come pretty much cascading down pretty quickly. Our reserve position at the low point was $2.6 million in FY18, FY19, 3.7, FY20, 3.7, and again, we're looking at FY21 to be 3.7 or higher, hopefully $4 million. And it's kind of interesting to me that if you're looking, and again, you don't have inflation built in, but if you look at pure bond ratings, if you add in stabilization fund now, we're pretty much we're over our 2010 levels. So, as we were acquiring our AAA bond rating, it was on the heels of the Great Recession when our reserves started to swell. And again, I think from an absolute dollar or our total dollar value, our reserve levels now are similar, or they will be a little bit higher than they were in total back in FY 2010. And I guess one other interesting item would be we spent down our reserves ahead of operating overrides in fiscal 2004. Our reserve levels went down to $85,000. And part of it was, I think, the view was, how could we ask the citizens for more money if we had millions in the bank? Now, that theory was from almost 20 years ago. I don't see us being able to go that low anymore, if depending on what's going on. But it's an interesting chart on the last 20 years of where our reserves are, or where they've gone. This chart, John is awesome at working with the state and different agencies on getting grants and earmarks. This chart puts together some of that. There is a fabulous grant tracker on the town's website. If you go to government, town website, go to government, town manager, grant tracker, you'll pull up a wonderful spreadsheet that gives you these numbers. The majority of this would be Kelly's Corner, but this is just a quick little chart to show you that, the amount of outside leverage that's been created. And again, the majority of those are Kelly's Corner. There's some CARES Act money in there. The CDBG Regional Micro Enterprise Grant is in there. But again, if you're interested, it's on the town website under the town manager page. And again, that's kind of our quick high-level version. We'll be closing the books formally over the next couple of weeks. Free cash is usually certified in September. And I don't know if I could take any questions. Thank you very much for your patience.
Steve, what is the definition of an earmark? From your last slide.
So to me, an earmark is money that is specifically set aside primarily by the state for a certain purpose.
Hey, Steve, thanks for the presentation. Just a couple questions on the reserve slide. And, we were talking about this Moody's downgrade to AA1, and two of the items that Moody's cited that were essentially, as far as their methodology goes, puts us in a high triple B category. Obviously, these are two factors of like a dozen that they look at. So they take them all together, they weight them all, and at the bottom pops a number which is AAA, AA, single A, whatever the letter is. And the two that stood out most predominantly were the double B parts of it, which were the trend in fund balance declines. And over a 5-year period, they'll look at that as being 18% of revenues, and now it's like 12% of revenues, roughly speaking. And so that deterioration from 18 to 12, 6 percentage points is where they would get to that triple B part of that ranking. And so to put a fine point on it, what they specifically said, 5 years of operating deficits, and then a deterioration in these fund balances over this time period, which has led to that weighting difference between them, and that was their prerogative. And they also used the phrase, currently the way it is, it's well below other AAA communities. And then again, in their methodology, there's a single A rating. There's a bunch of different parts of it. I know you're familiar with a lot of this, so I'm just mostly kind of explaining it to the committee themselves. But, you know, I appreciate how you have it displayed here, and it includes a stabilization fund. And as a caveat, Moody's has their own methodology on determining fund balances and cash balances, and we use a different terminology that's much more commonplace, I think, for all of us to understand it and make sense of it. But long story short is anything coming out of like the Great Recession or with the stabilization fund, they still have their methodology for calculating this, and it kind of is what it is. And the trend would not bode well for the future. We'd be hard pressed to say that we're going to see a stabilization in that deterioration. At least I don't think so. So I guess my question to put a bow on it is, you know, how do you think about Moody's methodology? And I don't want to get into the weeds for this committee. It is really kind of in the weeds and technical in nature and their own methodology. But how does the town factor that into how they think about the credit rating? Or is it this form of the information, which is what we typically would use?
Yeah, yeah, we heard from Moody's in late June. You know, they had, in their defense, they had been in touch with us in the past couple of years over you know, our reserve levels. You know, we chatted with them long and hard about the 5 years of deficits, and in their mind, these are when we use or pledge reserves, and our replenishment might be a little bit less in total. And we tried to review this kind of history with them and discuss a controlled drawdown of reserves, and we kind of went through it with them. I'd also say to you, Dave, that, you know, as you know, our reserves went as low as $2.6 million, our free cash. We're up close to 50% higher at $3.7 million. But to your point, the dollar amount was just too low. And I think, you know, we'll see what happens. But, you know, at times in front of this committee, and, you know, I think holding $9 to $10 million in free cash, Moody's would love.
Yeah.
I think all the rating agencies would love that. But, you know, I think when we got to that level of reserves, it was decided that that was too much and that we'd have a controlled drawdown and we'd put some money into stabilization. So, you know, in terms of operations, our mandate from the boss has been to maintain or increase reserves. And, you know, John came here at the low water mark of $2.6 million. And again, I think, you know, we've worked to shore that up in this fiscal year with a local receipt delta out there, and using $595 in free cash at town meeting. Our goal was to have at least $1 million turn back to kind of replenish what was taken out. So from operations, our operations, Dave, it would be maintain or improve our reserve level. But I think you're absolutely right. They singled out the dollar value of reserve levels was too low. they also had,
That changed too.
yeah,
And just to be clear, what they really highlighted was that dollar values change over a 5-year time period. So the numbers
Yep.
that they had were going from 18% to 12.7%, something like that. And that number, and so I don't disagree about the point about, is 9 million too much? Is it too low? And of course, the agencies would love just tons of cash. I agree completely. So I just, to take it at a higher level is improving the credit rating something that the town is considering, or is it, you mentioned improving reserves? And again, we're maybe talking apples and oranges with their methodology versus how we look at it.
yeah, we're not concerned right now about the town's credit rating. We stopped using Moody's as our primary rating agent in 2004, and we moved over to Standard & Poor's. But no, we're not concerned about our credit rating. Again, we are trying to listen to the street, listen to the market. And again, our position is that our free cash level should be maintained and move forward. And that's what we've been telling the rating agencies for a couple of years now, and we've been able to deliver, on those results. So, yeah, I think the other important thing to us is, the credit rating is important. The ability to get out of a jam is important too. And the ability to avoid a financial crisis on some levels can be averted with the power of the bottom line budget tool, where the town manager has the authority to shut down certain aspects of the operation if you see a problem with revenue. And John's ability to pivot and, contract operations quickly, I think is something that has served us well and can help keep us out of harm's way. And that's a difficult concept to convey to a rating analyst, especially when every town in the state does not have that authority. We've had that authority here, I think, for 35 years, bottom line budget. It is just an extremely powerful tool to allow, the town manager and the board to contract operations, if necessary, to cover revenue loss. So, yeah, and again, to your point, Dave, the change in reserves. Again, we tried to review with Moody's that this was a controlled drawdown, that we felt that the $9.3 million in free cash was too high, and that we had a controlled drawdown, and maybe we came down too low, and we're pushing the number back up. But I think they're very analytical. The reality of it is, we've done our big borrowing. Once, Dave, you know this stuff better than I. The spread between a AAA and the next rating down, it used to be a quarter, an eighth of a point. With rates so low now, you know better than I that there's there's less cost to not being at the top, now.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, of course. There's also sort of this, I don't hate to use the word status, but, as we've talked about, there's not a whole lot of AAA communities in the state of Massachusetts. And it's, from my perspective, just, on the finance committee, it's the trajectory that can be concerning, is they do note 5 years of operating deficits. They do note a drawdown of reserves, and ignoring all the mechanics of their methodology, but those things are all true. And so it's just, from our perspective, I think, I won't speak for everyone, but it's good to see the town recognize, that, and it's good to hear that you've had a lot of conversations with them. You're obviously very informed on it, and I think this is something that sounds like, the town is taking seriously. And yeah, at the end of the day, is it 10 basis points, 15 basis points, whatever the number is, it's a small thing when rates are so low. But I look at it as more than just the simple borrowing cost, because that's a slippery slope. You could say, well, then what's wrong with a single eight-town community? And let's run these reserves down to zero if we're only looking at borrowing cost. Not that I'm proposing that, but just set it up.
So, can
Gee.
I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
I was just wondering, what are the relative free cash positions of communities, other communities that have maintained their AAA rating?
Well, I'll tell you, I had the report up here, but for example, in 2016, they say cash balance as a percentage of revenue was 18%, and in 2020, it was 12.7%, so down 5.3%. They don't specifically say what other AAA communities are, but they do use the phrase, quote unquote, fallen well below that of AAA rated communities in Massachusetts and throughout the country. Now, Steve's made some fair points, and this is, to his point, Moody's has their own mechanical methodology for calculating this, just to have like an apples-to-apples comparison between us and everybody else. So if there's a bottom line budget or something like that, they can't just asterisk it and say, oh, well, Acton has a special power here, and we can give them a one-notch upgrade or what have you. So, but to answer your point, to circle back is, it's not so much that number that I just described, which they say is AA, but it's that deterioration over 5 years that's a big number for them, and that's what's BBB using their methodology.
Go ahead, Jason.
So I did also want to ask a clarifying question, because the way I read the opening line of the Moody's downgrade made it seem like they were much more concerned with the trend than with the absolute value. So is it truly the absolute value of the reserves, or the absolute value of the percentage of our reserves, or is it the fact that we were purposely running a deficit, even though as a committee we've been saying for 6 years, don't use reserves to plug operating budgets. That goes back to the original point of view when I first came on the committee 6 years ago. So is it the absolute value that's truly the problem? Or is it the fact that we planned to draw down, or both?
I think it's both, but Dave, what do you read in the credit report?
The absolute amount in the most recent year is, on their methodology, either A or AA, so pretty high quality. But it's those two BBs for the trend of running deficits. Then the deficits have led to that cash balance.
Moral of the story, we'd not be in this position if we had not used $1 million plus reserves to plug the operating budget for the last 6 years.
Yeah, just because that balance has deteriorated, and that's what they
One's causal the
ding
other.
us.
But
Yeah.
we've said from the beginning, for
Yes.
years now, we've been saying, don't use reserves to, don't count on reserves and count on the past performance of having turnbacks. We've been saying that for all 6 years. Maybe now maybe now they'll listen. But I do want to also say that I agree that we should not overreact to this, because we've done our huge borrowing for the fire station. This will become more interesting. And again, the difference between AAA and AA1 when interest rates are at 2% is de minimis. But, we've got another $30 million project that the town wants to bring down upon us, which we're going to have to borrow for. At these rates, who cares? If we hit inflation in the next couple of years, we're going to care. So I would very much like for the advice that we've given to the select board for the last 6 years to be followed. I have other questions, but I'd like to please make sure that we finish the AAA conversation before we move
Okay,
forward.
Adam.
Yeah, so first off, thank you. I particularly love this chart. I love that you've gone back 20 years. It's really important to know where you've come from and where you're going to. And my point to that is that when you look at bond rating agencies for municipalities, they're not unlike credit rating agencies in that they're tremendously short-sighted, is how I would describe them. And my interpretation of their ruling is that it's very dependent on the delta, right? What's happening now? And they're only short-sightedly looking back 5 years. They're only looking at the fact that in the past 5 years, our free cash has steadily gone down, and they see that as an alarming trend. What they're ignoring is the 5 to 10 years in front of that, where it went up at an alarming trend, which could be alarming in other ways. So I'm not at all bothered by the report that Moody's gave out, and I can tell that Steve isn't either. And I think that the free cash policy that we voted last fall will start to stabilize this, so that in the future, when Steve or Steve's predecessors in the future show us a 20-year chart, it's going to be very normalized. You're going to see your 3 to 5% free cash across the board, and when a bond rating agency sees that for 5 years in a row, they're going to say, this is a very stable, well-run, well-financed town. And then that 12% versus 18% is going to be a much less important portion of their ratio.
Steve?
Yeah, I just want to point out that when I joined the committee, it was at that bottom part. And I'm personally responsible. No. To give a little bit of history, this chart doesn't show it, but we were also sitting at that point in time on $6 million in what was called the Neswick Reserve, which was for the transfer station. It was for the eventual closure and environmental cleanup of the transfer station. And in fact, we never closed it, and it never had to be. No, this was our own transfer station. So that money that had been set aside for I don't know how many years wound up migrating eventually into free cash, because at some point the Department of Revenue decided that it was indeed free cash. It was unencumbered $6 million. So that's part of that bump there. Now, over the next few years, we used it to fund one-time capital, so we didn't have to tax the taxpayers for that. Don't remember the year, Steve, but we also found $2 million in unspent warrant articles.
Probably 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
Steve Elcott here, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, so now I'm up to $8 million in found money. And we had a lot of years of good turnbacks. A lot of it fueled by revenue growth, new growth. We then started the downward cycle. A lot of what you see there is land purchases. We can all recite the list. 1.8 for Walker, $1 million for River Street, and so on. So you quickly get to, a $4 million fall in one-time expenditures. None of this is extraordinary, and none of it should be of potential concern to a rating agency. I guess I'd also like to ask the question, how many AAA-rated communities haven't raised taxes in an operating override in the last 15 years? So I put a lot more stock in what S&P says. Moody's put out a negative outlook on AB right after regionalization, claiming that they were tapping their reserves too heavily to balance their budget. Well, they didn't get any of the reserves in regionalization, so their reserves went from, probably close to the statutory limit of 5% in 2013 or 14 down to, because they doubled the size of their operating budget, down to about 2% the next year. Moody's didn't get it. Okay, they couldn't see the background. And I guess to Dave's point, they're stuck on their formulas. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in what they have to say. And yeah, at the moment, it's not going to amount to much of anything. Have we heard from Standard & Poor's?
No, we haven't.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike?
Yeah, I think this is a great chart, especially 20 years of history really tells a story, especially with a low of 85K up to a high of over 9 million. That tells a lot about your budget and the controls behind it. Although the most recent history, it shows that we've sort of eliminated a lot of the peaks and valleys of the reserve, level of reserves, if you, especially if you look at this, add in the stabilization numbers, that, we sort of flattened the curve. But for a chart like that, I would also like to see, and we have been talking about this in our point of view, maybe a overlay of a band that would show an upper and lower limits of what these reserves should be. What's reasonable, what would turn on the yellow light, what would turn on the red light, and what's good to be in the green. But I think that chart indicates that we have definitely flattened the curve and we're headed in the right direction. And obviously we need to, closely monitor these, because as they said, when you're talking about levels of $9 million in reserve, you're overtaxing the people. And that's why those numbers have come down, to return it to more reasonable and conservative level. So I like the chart.
Adam?
Steve, do we know if Moody's or any of the other agencies take into account the stabilization as well as the free cash, or are they looking just at free cash? I get the impression they're
I
just looking
believe
at
they
free
do,
cash.
but stabilization funds are not certified in this state.
Right.
Like our free cash, they send out a letter, and they don't do that for stabilization funds, Adam. But
So I feel that gives a double negative count, because the money is still there that they say is missing. The trend hasn't been as extreme as they are probably counting it. And of course, managing this going forward means that something like the new 10-year CIP will help us to add more money to the stabilization going out in future years, so that when we get hit with a DPW building that's going to cost $32 million, we've planned for it 10 years in advance, and we've been growing a stabilization fund, and then you're not spending down all of the town's money in one whack, right? Rather than coming at the last minute saying, we need a lot of money to build something. Where are we going to get it?
I don't know, but it's not going to be $32 million, Roland.
I think something to keep in mind is that, kind of directed at Adam on this one, is that stabilization, in order to take money out, you have to go to town meeting and get approval for that, versus the bottom line budget, where John can move things around. If you have the free cash, you can use that free cash once it's certified for that year. So I think that's something that we need to be cognizant of too as well, because we could say, oh, you're going to build your 32 million Taj Mahal down at the transfer station, and you go to town meeting, they say, we want to take 10 million out of stabilization, and town meeting says no, and now what do? So I think that's kind of how Moody's probably looks at that, is, or the state looks at that. It's not necessarily free cash to use right there and then. Yeah, we do need to have that. We do need to have stabilization. And if you do recall that we just had the town take money out of stabilization too. So that part is going to fall. So that stabilization fund number is going to come down for FY21, or the next one we take that out. So I'm just a little bit concerned with that. I did have another question on revenues in your model that you show with the up and down arrows. Commuter lot. I don't know what the revenue is and how much you brought in this year, but I could see that if this pandemic continues, that you should count on revenue from the commuter lot being zero, and then whatever comes in is just a bonus.
Yeah, I think the revenues were projected to be about 290,000. They came in about 50,000. So, I mean, we really experienced a financial, negative experience there. Again, at one point, there were 5 cars in the lot during this fiscal year.
You could have the situation whereas that people saying, hey, I've now been driving to work in the city or to my office instead of taking commuter rail, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go back on the commuter rail. My car's more reliable type of thing. And I know that's happening in the T saying, hey, our ridership is down, and then you had another train that didn't pay attention and slammed in the back of another one, and all this fun stuff recently, and I think that that's part of, you're gonna see that for a while. And I'm sure heck glad that we never built a parking garage there and paid for that, because we'd be paying a big debt and getting no revenue.
Dave, did you still want to?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on the comparisons between Steve's chart and what Moody's looks at. And Moody's cash balance at the end of 2020 for the town of Acton was $12.3 million. So they obviously have, different funds and ways of calculating this and adding it up that, again, not apples to apples, just to be very clear about that. I'd also point out, I believe the Walker property was paid for by the stabilization fund. So, there's a lot of flexibility in getting access to that cash.
I think River Street was paid by stabilization.
They were both replenished.
Yeah, but it came from free cash to the stabilization.
That's right.
All right. Jason?
Back to the red, green, yellow chart. I think it's safe to say that both the commuter lot and the ambulance fund are probably mostly impacted as a result of COVID. And God willing, if everyone gets vaccinated, then those two funds should, in relatively short succession, 2 or 3 years from now, get back to a normal run rate. What percentage of the ambulance shortfall is systemic? And the reason I ask is because we spend quite a bit of money on the ALS, the Advanced Life Support Initiative, with the explicit statement of it's going to end up making us money in the long run. And for this to come back as negative in the year of COVID is not a surprise. But if this comes back negative, or if the ALS is not paying off as much as we thought and it's being masked by COVID, the sooner we find out about that, the better. So where does the ALS initiative fit into the shortfall on the ambulance fund, and or does it have any impact on the FY22 outlook?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'd have to go back and look a little bit, but there really hasn't been, this fund overall has been a very predictable fund in terms of its revenue estimates. So, when we went from BLS to ALS, I think the kick up in revenue was about $350,000. And, we went from, $700,000, $800,000 a year to estimating $1.2 million. So, our revenue, we've met our revenue expectations. The subsidy's actually gone down. We've lowered the subsidy to the ambulance enterprise fund over time. So I think ALS has done exactly, what we thought it would do. It would, we would cover our cost, and more importantly, we would lower response times for critical emergency situations. But yeah, Jason, I think this is a blip on the screen and again, I'm surprised that the revenue wasn't down more with COVID. If you think about what happens, the schools were kind of shut down for a good period of time. There weren't a lot of people out in the street. You could get to work in 5 minutes. I'm really amazed that its revenues were this high. So I think you're going to find that this is a blip on the screen, and that in 22, again, we return to our normal levels. And again, to take in, 85 to 90% of our revenues in an activity that's predicated upon people being out doing things, unfortunately breaking legs and crashing into things. That's what they do. For that fund to only be off, 10, 12, 14% to me during that whole fiscal year was amazing. So I think you'll see this as a blip, and I don't think that, I think ALS is working real well. In my mind, it's pulling in the revenues and it's lowering response times.
Just making sure it's not being masked. I have a separate question.
Go ahead.
Lastly, you just raised a point a couple minutes ago about how with the bottom line budget, you're able to rein things in quickly. what metrics do the town use to decide that these restrictions, the reining in, needs to end? Otherwise, why not keep it reined in and keep the taxes low in perpetuity? What are the canaries in the coal mine that make you say, okay, we can't do these extraordinary measures any longer? And/or conversely, did you find out in the course of last year, yeah, maybe there are some things that we just don't need to spend our money on because even without them, there's not been a pushback, there's not been a clamoring, there's not been a reduction, a palpable reduction in town services?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, sitting in the middle of this, in my spot, you experience a lot of different things. You know, we went into the fiscal year with a complete, pretty much hiring freeze and a spending freeze. By the time we got to Q2, you know, close to November or December, it was clear to us that two things were happening. One was the property tax quarterly collection rate was continuing at 99% plus. And by the middle of the year, we had started to kind of refine where the local receipt problem was going to be. It wasn't until probably January or February when we got that first big commitment, excise commitment, that we kind of knew where the number was going to be. And we estimated a local receipt shortfall, you know, late winter, early spring. So, you know, at that point, you know, I think, you know, once we knew the total, what we were looking at in the February, March timeframe, I also think you have to understand that, you know, approximately, I don't know, 50, 60% of our labor is driven through a collective bargaining agreement. So when you have a hiring freeze in the world of a CBA, when a fireman or a policeman and sometimes a DPW worker are out, and we have a hiring freeze, you're going to replace that time, a time and a half. So at some point, John loosened up the strings at the base of the needs pyramid, which is public safety, and he slowly opened up and started filling the public safety needs. So I don't know, you know, if that answers your question. There was no magic bullet where we said, okay, let's start spending. It was...
I'm afraid it doesn't answer my question. I understand that once you saw that your revenues came back, you said, okay, fine, time to bring back the services. I would have much preferred you actually monitor if the response times were getting too long, what percentage of overtime were we paying. I would have much preferred it be from a need-based rather than a, oh, gee, look, people paid their bill, we get to spend the money now. I would have much preferred it come from the bottom up than from the revenue side down. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Well, and we did that as well. You know,
so what metrics were you using for that bottom side up?
Well, we would meet quarterly, you know, with our public safety chiefs, DPW chiefs, and we'd go through, you know, different things that were going on in their operation. And the key thing, I think, for them was the unfilled vacancies had become unreasonable for them to deal with. And again, on some levels, you know, with a collective bargaining, with unfilled vacancies, you end up paying time and a half instead of straight time. But yeah,
you have those numbers, right? We can take a look at that and see where it came in.
Sure, we could look at total, you know, overtime and different things for the different CBA entities, absolutely.
Definitely trying to understand where the need came from.
Steve?
Yeah, switching to the transfer station. I understand now nobody wants to buy our trash, that's too bad, but is our utilization at the transfer station up or down?
You know, I don't have that level of detail. Corey York, Director York will have to get that. I basically was able to go as far as identifying that the line item that really put us over the edge, which was the recycling line item, which was way over, you know, way over.
And do we know what % of the people in town use the transfer station?
I don't have that.
Yeah, if you would, could you get that information? I'd appreciate it, thanks.
Anyone else? All right, thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Good job. Not too sad.
If you wouldn't mind sending me the page with the reserve numbers. Well, I'll take the whole presentation, but
I'll send the whole presentation.
I specifically want the Excel background of that from which you generated that slide as well,
Okay,
so that we can make it match when we shove it into the point of view this year.
okay.
And maybe put the
Sure.
upper and lower recommendations.
Yes, we can.
We'll send it to the whole committee.
We can definitely do that. All right, point of view drafting group. So, that's okay.
Everybody leaned back at the same time.
We sort of voluntold Sahana that since the clerk doesn't take notes anymore, it might be interesting if it was the clerk's position to always be the chair of the point of view drafting group.
So I have a question before we start.
Sure.
That. Did we ever dissolve the point of view group that we had created, not the last year, but the year before?
It was never a,
Officially.
yeah, so our point of view drafting group typically isn't a committee in the sense that it needs minutes and posting of agendas, because it's 2 or 3 individuals. It's not ever a quorum. So for us, that's never been anything that we need to officially dissolve. But no, so technically it would still be me and you and Christy, or, I forget.
I
which-
think it was Christy, myself, Jason.
Yep,
It's not technically anything. It's a group
Okay.
of people that
Yeah,
get together.
Jason
from
is
time to
trying to
time
move
meet.
away from that. saying-
that's okay.
It's a year-by-year thing, so when we vote the final point of view for whatever fiscal year, I think it just.
It's gone.
Dissolves.
It dissolves by
Yes.
itself. Okay, fair enough.
So what you'll need, obviously, is people who've done it before, and all of the data and notes, which I'll happily send
Which
to you.
comes from you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And of course, anybody who wants to sit in on the drafting group could indicate that.
Who would volunteer to be on the drafting group with me? And I'll make sure that it won't be too many times.
Excellent.
Awesome.
All right. Any other
Anyone
takers?
else? Great, thank you.
All right. We
We
have
just need just 3, or we can have
Just-
one more, right?
just 3 is a good
Three's
number.
fine. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mike and Roland.
I'd be happy to
Perfect.
be the outreach coordinator.
Excellent. Look at that. You already have an outreach coordinator
Perfect.
with lots of experience.
Done it 3 times.
Exactly. As far as the tentative schedule goes, we backdate it from, you've done this in the past, and I've heard you do it, and it's pretty impressive. You backdate when we have to get it done based on,
So I think,
oh, can you,
I wish I had a technical answer to that question, but no, I backdate it from the fact that we want to try and get it done by the 1st of October, the 15th at the latest, so that we can give the Board of Selectmen enough time to take our, the Select Board, to take our points of view into account before the budget Saturday that is usually in early December.
okay, so we'll work
So
out a calendar.
I would say soft deadline of October 1st, hard deadline of October 15th is something that we should strive for.
To get the draft ready,
No, to get it finalized by the committee.
finalized one.
So,
That doesn't leave a, yeah,
not
that
a lot of
doesn't leave
time.
a whole lot of time.
so
It's very
basically,
quick.
from this point on,
It's all we
every
do.
meeting we have, we will discuss the point of view until it is firmed up.
Okay. So I was thinking of, August is going to be pretty hectic, so summer. So if we can start working September, I mean, we can meet once, but I know we don't have the time. So are we meeting again in August, 3rd week of August?
We are definitely meeting again in August. We are meeting on the 24th.
I won't be here.
Adam will not be here.
We just want to make sure that we don't want to be so late with our point of view that we don't give the Select Board any time to incorporate it.
Right, and this,
Otherwise it makes it easier for them to ignore it.
so this can be last year's point of view with as many updates as we can get into it for now. And then we go through it and we decide if there are any, big changes that need to be made, or my guess is it will be big changes simply because last year's point of view was pandemic-based, and going forward, who knows what we're doing. But
That's fine. So between the three of us, we'll come up with a plan to meet sometime either later this week or hopefully early next week, if that works. Oh, you're gone? From what
no.
are the dates that you're out?
all right, so why don't you guys see after the meeting if you can find some time that
yeah.
works?
That's fine.
Yeah, for the record, I also see that it would be a much more summarized and concise point of view, not as extensive as,
That's your
Last
prerogative, draft.
That's the joy of being on the committee and not having me lead it anymore.
choose.
Exactly. So I'll get you all of those documents.
Okay, yeah.
I would,
if
I would
can get it
concur,
to
it's
you.
getting a little long.
Yes.
All right, challenge accepted, so we'll try.
Thank you, and happy to absolutely help any way,
Yeah,
anytime.
thank you. If I can get the documents tonight,
I'll probably send you a whole Google Drive.
yeah, that would be
Thank-
great. Thanks, Christine.
Great. All right. Finance Committee Policy Development Discussion. So what that is, we worked really hard to come up with a great reserve policy last year.
Free cash policy.
Free cash policy last year specifically, not an entire reserve policy, which is what has mostly led to where we are now.
And
Because
we promised we would come back and make a reserve policy.
we sure did.
Yes, we did.
And Jason's expressed a lot of interest in having a policy that discusses in one way or another all of the different reserve buckets.
That's right.
And so this is a great time to make a list of exactly what policy positions we would like to have. And once we determine that, we can divvy them up. People can work on drafting them, bring them back to the committee for review. And most importantly, once we all confirm that we as a committee agree that these will be our set policies, we can then bring them to the select board and make sure that our policies align with the practices of the town and that they're operating knowing what our financial recommendations are. That make sense? So we have a free cash policy. We need to develop a stabilization policy.
Reserve,
Do we need, yes, reserve?
overall,
I think these all fall under reserves, right? So do we need an enterprise fund policy, or do you want a enterprise fund for each enterprise fund,
no,
or a policy for each one?
I don't want to get to the point of having a
Okay.
policy for each one. I think that's probably more than we want to insert ourselves into. But,
Okay.
but definitely an overarching reserves policy.
Okay, so then what other policies, Steve Noon, do you
No,
think
I was
it
just
would
going to
make
comment
sense?
on the enterprise funds. Some hold much larger retained earnings than others. It's not always a one-way trip. Those enterprise funds that we have subsidized out of the general fund over the years, that money can be reclaimed back to the general fund if it is no longer needed in the enterprise fund. So it is something that, while we don't need a policy on every enterprise fund, certain ones, ambulance, transportation, I think transfer station, maybe. We need to look at it in terms of some of those funds could be a part of a overarching look at reserves.
Okay, great. What I'd like to see is when we are discussing the budget and we're discussing reserves and we're discussing enterprise funds, that we have a greater understanding of what each of those entails and how those funds flow back to the town. And by having a policy, somebody will have done the deep dive on this and explained it to us as the committee so that going forward, we all just have a greater understanding and we have a written down expectation.
Yeah, I felt it was really helpful to sit down with Mr. Barrett and go over all of the enterprise funds as a group, and I think it's important to always think of them as a group and how they relate to each other and how they relate back, not just because of what they are in each of their functions, but also how they are treated by accounting standards within the state. Reading what's the name of that document that outlines how enterprise, it's funny because it's called like something F and a half, or it's the most strangely named law. Anyway, I'd be happy to be, I'll take the driver's seat on the.
Love to work with you on it.
Okay,
You have a
great.
co-pilot.
Yep, so I'll take those because I've already got a head start there.
Great. Steve?
Since I brought up the subject of unspent warrant articles, Steve, I know the law is, if it's not started in 3 years, it reverts back. Do we have a regular policy of reviewing that every year, or?
John usually reviews it once a year, or probably, he actually has a lot of interactions with accounting, so, he's all, as you saw at the last town meeting, he pulled a couple of unexpended warrant articles to help buy down, the capital article.
I know, and so my point is, shouldn't we all know about unspent warrant articles, and not just you and John?
Sure, I can get you a list of warrant articles if you'd like, if that's the request.
Well, if you do the review once a year, then maybe you could just report on what you found.
Did that include like the year, the article number, the warrant article number, and what year town meeting it was?
Yeah.
So that we have it. And also, if a warrant article was appropriated, say you appropriated $500,000, and the actual work came in at $300,000, you have $200,000 sitting there that was left over, is that also taken into that consideration as well when you do those?
That would be considered an open article.
And so,
Sure, if you voted 500,000, we spent 300,000, there would be 200,000 left. It's either spent in accordance with the original intent from town meeting, closed, or something like that. But we can get you something on the articles when we do that review, sure.
thank you.
Okay. All right, any other specific fiscal policies that we should try to define that would help moving forward?
I would love for a no surprises policy where we don't, things that we've been asking for years, they don't just come and say, we finished it and here it is and we're done now. In particular, I point to the 10-year plan where we've been asking to be part of the long-range capital plan, and they went out and got an outside party to take a look at things and then presented us with a final thing. That was, I felt completely caught off guard. I called Steve immediately and said, were you part of that? Because you've been part of the capital plan, you've been calling to be part of the capital plan for years, and I believe the phrase you used was, no, they hoovered it. They did it in a vacuum. So that, no, the other one is the DPW seems to have come, caught us off surprise, and also the regionalization, the dispatch regionalization. It shouldn't come to us when it's done and already been voted on by the select boards of the respective towns. So I would very much like for us to have a no sandbag policy.
Yeah, can I speak to that as well? Something that's been on my mind recently, and, my understanding is FinCom is that we're really sort of here at the behest of the select board to aid the select board, right? They're supposed to be asking us for help in decision-making and in evaluating financial decisions on behalf of the taxpayer. And I've only been on the committee for a short time, but I can already name numerous occurrences where something has come to us and presented to us to look at or even vote upon that, number one, I'd never heard of before, and number two, the select board had already voted to approve it. So what's the point of coming to FinCom? My opinion, take it for what it's worth, would be that if large budgetary items going to be presented to the select board for voting, then it would be similar to town meeting where the select board would say, okay, we'd like to get you on the On the agenda, you need to have all of your presentation, your ducks, all the people who need to speak, who need to answer questions, and we need FinCom's opinion on this as well, so that everybody stands up and says, okay, FinCom approves this, that type of thing. FinCom has looked at this, we have further questions. That all needs to happen at the same public forum where the select board is voting on those things, and not, we shouldn't, to me, the select board, if they're voting on any dollar amount, 300,000 or 60 million, they're voting on it in a vacuum if they haven't asked for FinCom's opinion.
You don't want to be a rubber stamp.
No.
Right. So one,
After the fact.
No, and you don't have enough time to do the due diligence if, it's already been decided upon.
yes.
So then it becomes the question of, well, then why are we here?
So we need to get involved with these sort of projects actually before the meeting in which the select board votes on it, simply because we would have to have a combined meeting in order to accomplish what you just described, where we would discuss it in the same meeting in which they voted on it. So one thing we need to do is improve our understanding of the select board's calendar and what's happening in their meeting. And also, David has offered to enlighten us when bigger budget items are going to come up so that we can invite them based on what we're seeing that they're discussing and on what the select board sees as something that they would definitely need our involvement in. Sana?
Roland had the microphone on.
Roland.
So mine was that we have to know about these things. We can't have select board, as you just said, make a decision, and we never even heard of the project.
Right.
And as what we're supposed to be doing is opining on all things financial to the town and the town entity.
So it behooves
So-
us to be more aware of what's on their calendar, on their agenda.
Right, but I think they also have an obligation to let us know,
Exactly.
because we're not able to attend every meeting, et cetera, and also the manager's office saying, hey, we'll look at this project, it's coming down the line, I want to make you guys aware of it. And then we can take it from there. The RSCP thing, and I sent my comments to you to forward to the town manager, that there's something that says, well, this is usually not paid by this and this, and I'm like, well, it's an expense. Who pays it then? It's not paid by the entities. It doesn't just evaporate. The state's just not going to give us extra money to do that, to pay those expenses every year going forward. So there were certain things like that were in that presentation that didn't jive. We're going to say 375,000. Is that yearly, annually? Is it a one-time shot? And another thing to look at with that is that we lose some sort of control. The town loses that control when they give it to an entity like that. It's not in control of our own town anymore. And that can have big implications later on down the line. I mean, I call in, well, where's Simon Rill Road? Well, where a local dispatcher from your town is going to know exactly where it is. And I had that when they're cutting over the 911 system a while back. Well, can you give me directions? You're 911, you should know where I'm calling from, you should know how to get there. It shouldn't be, can you give me directions to your house? As this is, my stove is on fire? I mean, that stuff doesn't sit well, and doesn't sit well with the taxpayer who is paying to have emergency services. So, that's the thing. I also think we need to look at very closely is the outfitting of the new fire station. Because I guarantee it's going to come down the line, well, we're going to want new trucks, we're going to want this, we're going to want this additional. So I just want us to be made aware of that.
Excellent. All right, Sahana?
All the points are actually just right. I agree with all of you. One more thing, what about the policies? Many of the presentations that come up to the board, I'm pretty sure all of us would have many more questions. I'm there, but I'm sure that you guys might be thinking differently than what I would be thinking. So those, I think, might be of concern too, because we don't get to hear until everything is all set and there's nobody making presentations to the finance committee, which might have a financial impact too.
Well, Finance Committee should be making a presentation at that point to the Select Board on the night that they're voting on whether or not to approve a budgeted item.
Right. So in order for that to happen, if you're the liaison to the select board again this year, if you see items on their agenda, or you are in a meeting and an item comes up that you think we may possibly want to know more about, Just if you could shoot us even at that night, just an email that we may want to then go watch that part of the select board meeting,
Okay,
so that we can start to build a better idea of the
Okay.
lead up to these decisions, so that by the time the vote happens, it's not too late for us to have an opinion. And then, again, I have secured with Mr. Martin that he will make attempts to bring things to our attention that he thinks would be in our wheelhouse. Jason?
Yeah, so part and parcel of that, and I apologize, I haven't been the liaison to the select board in years. On the school side, as you know, from being the liaison for years, they always have a first read and a second read. So there is never this is the first time it's come up in front of the board or the committee, and we're taking a vote on it tonight. I would love for that to be, for that kind of cadence to occur as well, so that we're not caught off guard.
I mean, we may decide on a policy where, you know, we give a recommendation to the select board that any budgetary item over X amount of dollars should, you know, follow some procedure.
Yeah. That's,
They can choose to follow it or not.
well, yeah,
It makes sense.
Yes. My hope would be that if we develop such a policy and that it's thought out and well-written, and then we present it to the select board, and then we can have a discussion about it. And that should make everybody in alignment with what works best. All right, any other policy ideas at this stage?
Yes, and I'm staring right at Steve Barrett. On the budget book, can we please have 5 years of back data in the budget book? It's a complete vacuum looking at half a fiscal year and one previous fiscal year.
We can look at it, Adam. The system we use is their standard layout is kind of working backwards. The year you're looking to fund, the current year you're in, and then the prior year or two, which is only 3 or 4. So we can work on that. I'll talk to John about that.
Yeah, I would very much like to see 5 years of previous
Thank you for
fiscal
not asking
history.
for 10, sir.
I would love 10, but I'm like Moody's. I'm going to look very near term,
2.5.
5 years, and then I'll come and say, this trend is alarming.
Thank you. Anything else? Excellent. All right. We do not have any minutes, but I will take liaison reports if there are any. Roland? Dave? Mike? Adam?
No.
Jason?
I have nothing to report other than I think everybody had a chance to walk through the school, the new twin school on the school building project. So if there's any warnings or alarms or anything that you want me to relay back to the school building committee, please let me know.
All right. Thank you. Steve?
I guess I'm a one-man OPEB committee at this point, but Steve Barrett did send out the latest actuarial report for the town, which looked very good. The only negative factor was a change in the discount rate assumption, and so that's kind of old news. This year's, I'm sure, doing much better in terms of investment for performance. So the current projection for it being fully funded or paid off is 2034, which even Mike and I may live to see. The rest of you most certainly will. On the school side, their projected payoff year is still
24.
No, it's not that bad. It was that bad. It's 2059 at this point, so. And that comes back to the percentage of the recurring liability that the town funds is much greater than what the school
Not our
funds.
time.
So,
Isha?
I unfortunately missed the last meeting.
No problem.
So
Sahana?
I believe there were 2 select board meetings, and I did not attend yesterday's meeting, which they were discussing the goal setting for the current year. So I was not sure, did ActonTV record that? I couldn't see the recording, yeah. So it was not a public meeting anyways to begin with, so. Yeah, but you didn't take the input, right? So from the public. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was not there. So I was there the week before, the 7/26, and The select board got a presentation about the Federal CARES Acts Fund, and I think it was $2.9 million, and it was allocated to, most of it was spent on the AB School District, the Rental Assistance Program, the Mortgage Assistance Program, and the Food Distribution Program to the schools, and improvements to the building and employee safety. So coming back to the Rental Assistance Program, I think it was about $128K that was spent on rental assistance, which supported about 43 households below 80% AMI. And the Mortgage Assistance Program was $31K, which helped about 14 households or 10 households. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I've written here. I can't read my own handwriting, so that's about it. And I think there was additional COVID resources where it was spent on. And one of the presentations that I wanted to talk about was the plastic ban thing that we had a couple of years ago at town meeting. So there was a presentation by the same folks, and additional stuff that was presented. I would like you guys to take a look at it. And I do not remember the time that it was, probably after 8:40 or something, but I can send you the exact time where the recording is. I think that was of importance.
Yeah, I actually caught that part of the meeting. They are looking to implement a 10% charge for any checkout bags, which is a follow-up to kind of our recommendation that a plastic bag ban is ineffective without a fee, because then everybody switches from the plastic bags to the paper bags, which is basically what happened. So they're talking about a 10% checkout bag fee, but it would go to the retailer?
10 cents.
Sorry, 10 cents, yes. I don't know, 10%, no problem.
Ooh, a new tax.
10 cents per bag that would go to the retailer. And they're also looking for a ban on polystyrene and plastic number 6, which is a clear polystyrene, and none of that is recyclable.
Yeah, I think that includes all the spoons,
think
the
so.
utensils, the plates, and
Yep.
all of the stuff.
I think
good
clear
stuff.
clamshell containers, things
Yeah.
like that. But that is being started at the state level, right?
I think many towns are already supporting that initiative, and yeah.
Okay, excellent. Anything else anybody has to report?
And I wanted to ask our select board liaison here if I left out anything else from that meeting. It was a very long meeting because there was a lot of discussion on the trees. So
There was a lot of
yeah, there was a lot of discussion.
It was like an hour and a half
I
on
was
2
sitting right
trees.
there and I was going, oh my God. But interesting discussion.
Those trees. The only other thing, I guess, that I would bring up is that they're talking about doubling the deed excise tax on the sale of houses in order to fund a $300 million fund for $150 million for affordable housing trust fund and $150 million for climate emergency. So
This is the state.
this is the state. Yeah. So right now on a $400,000 house, your deed excise tax would be $1,824, so it would go to $3,648.
So this is a bill that is being proposed by Senator Eldridge. I think he's the sponsor of that bill. I didn't bring it up because this is legislation, and
Right.
I don't think we have control over it at the local level.
Yep.
And I think the board voted to support that bill.
Yep.
So.
I just found it of interest, but you're right. It's
yeah,
not anything we
it's
need to
not
have an
anything
opinion
that
on,
Yeah,
other than our own opinions on it.
absolutely, yeah.
All right. All that being said, I will entertain a motion.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions, some